Good morning to our Caron YouTube audience, and good morning again to those of you who are with me in person and those on the live stream. Today is the 2nd of January 2022. I find it amazing that we are into another calendar year. And I've found it helpful to start with some quick reflection on the occasion. It happens to be the 9th day of the 12 days of Christmas, for those who might be counting. It's several Sundays since the winter solstice, and I did a quick check, and it's a little discouraging because the increase in daylight crawls at the beginning, but we have 3 minutes more daylight now than we did on December 21st. So anyway, it's headed in the positive direction, so I'm grateful for that. We're in a new calendar year, and the primary audience of the address for this morning is Caron patients. So you all are here as the calendar flips, and there's some of you, I was chatting with you before the service began, there is a set of themes that I use for the Caron Chapel service, and interestingly, not only are in the beginning of the calendar year, but this year the calendar year and the topic calendar line up. So we are on topic number 1, Sunday number 1, 2022. And my topic number 1 for the Caron series of chapel topics is the word healing. And whenever I do this topic, which is about once every 18 weeks, I find myself reflecting on why it ended up being the first in the series, and that relates to the fellow, sorry the YouTube audience can't see it, but his portrait is on the wall over there, Father Bill Holbert. He was my predecessor in the role of lead spiritual care person here at Caron. He birthed the chapel service, and still very much present in my mind, and has an incredible legacy here in this place. And I want to pay some tribute to Father Bill as I walk through this topic and remember part of what was Father Bill's genius in his way of being was he condensed very, very rich insights into very pithy little sayings. And he became known for them. And you often have gestures that would go with the sayings. And one of the Father Bill maxims that relates to the healing subject, and he would say this almost every Sunday, is what you believe about addiction will determine how you are going to treat it. And that might seem self-evident to you, but I think it's actually quite profound. And I'd like to sort of dig into that just a minute to share with you. He would go on, and he would expand on that, to talk about 3 different ways that people have thought about addiction and that has influenced how they have treated us. Because I suffered from addiction. I'm a member of the community in long-term recovery. So family, society, and religious institutions. So family often have thought about the person who suffers from addiction as if we are, I'll use the word knuckleheads, like fools. I could be more shaming, but anyway, I'm guessing, especially as I look at you in the audience here, like you have heard this from people who love you. Why don't you just stop? What is wrong with you? Don't you know how important this wedding is, or don't you realize you're ruining your potential for your future, or we've already invested so much, or whatever? And the way that family treats the person who suffers from addiction, if they view addiction as foolishness, is shaming. They belittle and deride and insult and may even banish, right? That's what happened in my family. There were members of my family who were banished because they were not able to turn themselves around. Society's kind of concurrent shame-rich view had been to view addiction as criminality. And I'm not saying that's gone, but there are probably some of you in the audience here today who have paid that price, right? Gotten busted, gone to jail, been before a judge, had penalties, and I don't know how, I'm old enough to remember mandatory minimums. And I knew people who went to serve very, very significant amounts of time when arrested for what I thought were, an example of a person who comes to mind. I had a friend whose addiction progressed from weed to cocaine to crack cocaine. But there was a time when crack cocaine was viewed in a different light by the law. And so this guy was found to have crack cocaine, and he was sentenced to like 5 years because it was like a second or third offense that was drug related, but this time with the crack it was a mandatory minimum. And I don't know what you think, but do you think 5 years sentence for crack cocaine was like going to produce a positive outcome? And this was related to a period in our society. Again, I'm old enough to remember there was a period of time when one of the initiatives coming out of the White House was a Just Say No initiative. This idea that human beings could simply just say no to drugs, and that the answer of, since it was criminal behavior, the big effort of the federal government was going to be to protect the borders and stop the drugs from coming in, and then bust people who were selling drugs in our neighborhood and all that sort of stuff. So, what you believe about addiction will determine how you treat it. If you believe addiction is a crime, then you're going to imprison people who suffer from it, and you're going to make criminals of us all. And I would love to tell you that religious institutions in that period of time, maybe 50, 60, and hundreds of years ago, took a wiser view, because I'm sort of pro-wisdom traditions and spiritual care professions today. I didn't used to be. I was so cynical about religion, and it's so ironic that I would stand in front of you wearing this kind of garb. But the frequent representation of religious institutions about addiction is that addiction is sin, that it's disobedience, that it's a failure to follow the divine code. So if Jewish, then the Levitical tradition; if Christian, then the expectations of the commandments and the model given in the person of Jesus. Or in Islam, very, very strict addiction codes. In Buddhism, you have abstinence codes. In a variety of religious traditions, addiction is viewed as disobedience. And then I'm going to use a word that's laden with the West's religions, but repentance is the answer. So if you think that the religious person is accessing these drugs and alcohol, or whatever it is, alcohol is a drug, but accessing addictive processes, behaviors, relationships out of disobedience, then the invitation that the wisdom tradition would make is to come home and obey and start getting it right. But I don't know if you noticed how unbelievably shaming all three of those perspectives are. All three of those make the sufferer the absolute problem, and also singularly kind of responsible for effecting the solution. Is there another perspective? So another Father Bill maxim, and this is Father Bill maxim number 2 for today, is sickness, not sin. I remember he and I had long conversations about this. And I don't know where you are in your Caron experience, if you had a Monday morning presentation on the disease concept of addiction, but in a 28-day stay here, you are supposed to have that Monday morning lecture at some point. It was last given on the Monday right after Christmas. So last week. But in any case, in your therapy, in your small groups, and at Caron, we do teach about addiction as disease rather than as misbehavior in the moral sense. And some people really struggle with that, and I've come to understand why, because I've been hanging around this world for a long time. I've been sober for a long time, and then I've been in treatment for a long time. And I was doing some research for my message today, and I love the way we have access to things on Google. What does it say here? I Googled what is the general characteristics of a disease. A disease is a condition in which the presence of an abnormality of the body causes a loss of normal health. Fascinating. So, what does addiction meet that criteria? Is it an abnormality of the body? Turns out, I'm going to get there. And then, does it cause a lack of normal health? It does. It compromises our health and wellness, our functioning as relational beings. Some diseases are, we think all the time about diseases. It's hard to turn on any media source today and not hear about a certain disease. But diseases come in a whole variety of forms. What sort of type of disease are we talking about is the right question, I think, instead of whether, like, people are like, addiction is not a disease. Anybody who comes from that perspective has a bone to pick, and there's something that's driving that passion. But I think a more sophisticated way and a more gentle way of asking the question is, when we say addiction is a disease, what sort of disease are we talking about? And I would like to just use my time today to tell you that I've given that a tremendous amount of thought over the years since Father Bill gave me the sickness, not sin idea. And there are three people who have really influenced my thinking about what kind of disease this is. And some of them just in the last couple of years. So the names are Nora Volkow, Maya Salovitz, and Gabor Mate. And if any of you want those names at some point, let me know, and I can write them down for you. They're each three thinkers in different domains that have written about addiction and addiction medicine. And each of them in their own way has been quite controversial, but are coming to be accepted as really wise sort of speakers. So we're trying to move, stay with me, we're trying to move out of shame and to a different way of thinking about addiction that would give us a different way of treating addiction. So when we listen to Nora Volkow, she tells us where the abnormality of the body is. It's in the brain. And it's identifiable. She's figured out how to do SPECT scans that identify irregularities in people who suffer from our problem. If they track my brain and your brain, our brains look different on these kind of scans in two places. In the choice area of the brain, which is in the upper front lobe area of the brain, and in the emotion area of the brain, the limbic brain, the drives and passions area of the brain. So our brains are different than normies, normal people, in choice and passion areas. Gabor Mate helps us understand the genesis of that. How did it get to be the case that your or my brain is not quite like the normative sort of typical profile? And that's one of the things, too, about diseases. It doesn't mean that I'm all wrong and that other people are all right. There are gradations, right? And there's a severity scale of addictive disorders. And so this is not a binary and you are or you aren't. It's how sick or how badly is your brain sort of dysregulated in this way. But Gabor Mate wrote this book. Its lead title is Hungry Ghosts. I love that title. And what he points to is how incredibly important childhood development and trauma are in many people's presentation of addictive disorders. The bottom line for Gabor Mate is that you and I come by this honestly, that there's something in the rearview mirror of our lives that drove us to develop these unhealthy patterns of behavior until they became so automated that now they're like their problem in itself. And so look at childhood trauma, look at alienation, look at, even primal things like an adoption wound, look at, molestation, look at PTSD, look at all, there's a lot more. I don't want to get lost in a long lecture about it, but it's this idea of hungry ghosts, that there's something in my early history that probably contributes to why my brain became dysregulated in the way it has become. And then Maya Salovitz's also a really important book in 2016 called Unbroken Brain. She happens to really struggle with overemphasis on the word disease, because she says what happened to you and I is we have learned to be this way, that this is a learning disorder. well, that's still a disease. The definitions are fuzzy, they kind of cross over, but her point is that one of my Selleck's great terms is love gone awry. That what she's pointing to is that we suffer from a malady, I'll call it that, that's an old AA term for this thing. Our malady is that the apparatus of attachment and connection and meaning has fused itself onto things like heroin or sex apps or shopping or food. And we can see why we're here. If we believe that, if you believe that about addiction, that it's about hungry ghosts and about love gone awry, and that your brain has become different than others, then there's several things that fall off in it. One is quick fixes are not the answer. This is not like a tiny little micro adjustment. Retraining the brain is a comprehensive project. So 28 days is awesome. It's a great new beginning. It can arrest the immediate sort of crisis moment. But the real hallmarks of beginning to develop healthier brain functioning are going to be at 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, and even 10 years. And that may be depressing for you, but I think it's also really important to be honest with you that and incremental setbacks like return to use may sadly become part of the journey and should not be interpreted as total failure. So if you can reduce and decrease the harm that you're doing to yourself and others along the way, then you're making progress. Because this is a very, very difficult problem to address. And the last thing that I want to say about this is now I'm not a Father Bill maxim, but I'm going to call it a Jack maxim. If sickness not sin, which was Father Bill's maxim, then I'm going to say then healing, not repentance. What our project is, as an institution at Caron, and yours as a seeker of addiction recovery, is a project that seeks healing from an illness rather than repentance from bad behavior. The way Father Bill used to say it, we are not sick people trying to get well, or we're sick people trying to get well, we're not bad people trying to get good. And that's my point. That this is about, and what I do want to say is later in the service we're going to have an Islamic, a Jewish, and a Native American healing prayer. So wisdom traditions, Christian, pick any wisdom tradition. The shamans and the priests and the ministers and the rabbis and the imams and the medicine practitioners in indigenous tribal settings have been sought out for centuries for healing. Today, if you want to find it in Google, I wouldn't suggest you Google faith healing because that will take you down a rabbit hole that's sort of a different sort of place. I would Google spirituality and health. Today, that's the language. Today, people are realizing that spirituality and health are deeply connected. And if you Google spirituality and health, you'll enter a rabbit hole of thousands of different ways that people are understanding that could be yoga, mindfulness, prayer, faith communities, love. And Alcoholics Anonymous was a primal sort of instance, but it has all of the characteristics of a spiritual solution. And what I find myself excited to say to you as I'm trying to wrap up and get us on to the rest of the chapel service is that that's what we open the year with today. We open the year with this incredibly positive message that came from my dear friend Father Bill. That was sickness not sin, and that don't let people shame you about this. Allow yourself to be excited and hopeful that you can find a way forward we can become more healthy as human beings, and that the path about this is to sort of tackle the hungry ghost and learn to love better and become better constituents of our communities, and that this is the milestones ahead are very much in your grasp. And that's one of the other things that we've come to realize, is that we were measuring outcomes in addiction very poorly by just measuring, did people stay perfectly and completely sober forever, and otherwise, no, it's a failure. We never measure diabetes that way, we never measure heart disease that way. We need to stop measuring addiction that way. What we have found when we change our outcome measures in addiction to make them more sort of on par with other chronic illness is that people actually do really well when they get to come to places like this and avail themselves of ongoing supportive care. So if you've been told, oh, you have something that's just untreatable, that's a lie. You can absolutely do really well. You can absolutely do really well. So today, let's celebrate healing. Let's pray for healing. Let's practice things that will help us find healing. And those of you who sing or play music with us or share, and the relationship that we build, all of this is about this journey of healing that we are on. I'm grateful to celebrate that with you today. Thank you very much.